need to Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime, here on my next Avatar Weekly Discussion topic video. And this one I suppose is going to be a kind of a follow-up to my Iroh discussion video I did a good while ago at this point. It's basically going to go over, I think, some of the maybe kind of changes in mind I've had in that time, and just why I really think now we need to kind of have this kind of renewed interest in kind of really like presenting to the people who are making the stories at this point that Iroh is a character we want developed more, we want his full backstory, we want to see how all this stuff fits together, and basically get a lot of the gaps that relate to his story filled in. So obviously with Iroh, a lot of the discussion revolves around the fact that we have all of these amazing events in his life with no real exact kind of timeline of how they happened. And so it means that him in his earlier years is a little bit of an enigma as a character, in that I think, depending on what fan you ask, some would say like, oh, he was maybe a lot more like Ozai in his earlier years, and then the death of Liu Ten changed him like completely, and all of this stuff happened after that point. Whereas I think I'm more now kind of leaning towards, I think a good amount of the events that we hear about in Iroh's life actually happened prior to the death of Liu Ten, and then potentially it was really only some of the traveling around the world stuff and spirit world stuff that happened after the death of Liu Ten. But I think that's what makes him so interesting, in that we don't really know how different of a character Iroh was before and after the death of Liu Ten. I think it's fair to say he was never exactly like Ozai. He was always a different character, and that's the reason why Ozai doesn't seem to have any respect for Iroh at all, and doesn't really see him as much of a threat, and doesn't really see any competition there for the throne, basically. It's probably also why Azula doesn't really respect him all that much, because as powerful as we as fans know he is, she never respected his power, and that got her kind of almost, her underestimating Iroh got her into trouble a few times, for sure. So it leaves us in this odd position of like how enlightened was Iroh earlier on in his life versus how enlightened he is now. So I think the one thing that really fits into the timeline is that we know for sure that he became, a dragon. He had his interaction with Ran and Shaw, with the Ancient Sun Warriors, years before the series begins. So that happens before the death of Liu Ten. So that means he was judged worthy by the dragons, and he kept the secret of the Sun Warriors and basically lied about him defeating the last dragons prior to the start of the series, which I think is a very notable thing, because they very much established that, okay, most people in the Fire Nation military have the really heavy focus on power as kind of the way they go about their firebending. So the fact that Iroh earlier on in his life was judged worthy and knew the true way of firebending that long ago clearly suggests that obviously he wasn't just some evil character. And this obviously links into the fact of like, clearly also earlier on in his life, this is where he had that vision that he dreamt he would one day take over Ba Sing Se, and obviously it's a key aspect of like how he interpreted that. He initially thought that, okay, I'm royalty in the Fire Nation, it obviously would have to be me for my nation taking over Ba Sing Se, and that's the way to go about things, because he believes in destiny. When in fact it ended up being this kind of series of events where he ends up separate from the Fire Nation and takes Ba Sing Se to give it back to the Earth Kingdom. But still, he had to have had that vision, I think, long ago. Then, obviously, it comes into the bit of like, okay, he takes a kind of leave of absence from the Fire Nation after the death of Liu Ten. He basically abandons his position as Crown Prince, which is more or less why Ozai has to take over, and the whole incident happens with the death of Azulon. Because Iroh stays away, and this is probably realistically where he travels the world a bit, and probably learns stuff like how to do lightning redirection, though I think that could have come earlier. realistically though, if you take it that he took a break to travel the world, study waterbenders, learn that technique. Another thing, obviously, is when did he join the Order of the White Lotus? That's I think is a very difficult one to place, because it could be a case of like it is only after the death of Liu Ten, and because he traveled the world, he discovered the Order of the White Lotus and joined it. But because he's actually like the highest ranking member that we know, it would more make sense that he was kind of always initially part of it. But then it obviously begs the question of, given that he is basically like the highest ranking member of the group, who got him involved in it? Like, it would make sense that maybe it's Boomy, because Boomy's old enough that it would make sense that he was part of it for a very, very long time. But that obviously suggests that Iroh and Boomy met. Was it Paku, because of the whole I've been to the water tribe situation? Iroh learning from the waterbenders for lightning redirection. So there's definitely a few ways you could go with that, and it just overall presents a lot of story possibilities of like, you can create a dynamic with him and whatever person introduced him to the Order of the White Lotus, because I think it's very clear that it's an ancient organization. Iroh wasn't really involved in like the founding of it, so he just joined it, but how did he come to learn about it, and so on. The other thing would be, I suppose, how separate was Iroh from the goals of the Fire Nation? That being Azulan's goals of obviously to continue on Sozin's goals to basically continue with the war, to take over the entire world for the Fire Nation and spread their prosperity. That being the Fire Nation intent. So did he believe in that, or did he just kind of go along with things knowing that, okay, taking over Ba Sing Se is my destiny, I believe in that, so I'll focus heavily on that? But like, how involved with other battles was Iroh? Was there really any point where he was just super loyal to like the Fire Lord, basically, where he would do everything that was needed to, get Azulan what he wanted? Because I think it would be easy to just have it be a case of just Iroh was like the rebellious son who always was the one about balance and didn't really just go along with the Fire Nation kind of view of things, and he learned all this other stuff and so kind of abandoned the main goals of Azulan, whereas Ozai believed in all of that, and so the second born became the crown prince. But the way Azulan acts, he seems to really, really respect Iroh and gives him the respect as being the firstborn, that the role of Crown Prince is his kind of, by default, and Azulan respects that, and hence why he punishes Ozai for just asking about it, even though Iroh was missing. He basically didn't come back, and there was no news really about what exactly had happened, that he seemed to give Iroh the space when Liu Ten died, and kind of respect it that way. So I don't think you can necessarily just jump in and say that, yes, there was a rift between Iroh and Azulan. There was a rift between Iroh and like the Fire Nation as such. It seems like he was a very, very respected general, and it's kind of 50-50 more or less within the Fire Nation about people who respect him for who he was and what he did versus people who think he's perhaps a coward for abandoning the siege after the death of Liu Ten. But in a way, I think some soldiers, the more honourable people within the Fire Nation, respect him for leaving when his son died and like having those feelings, I suppose. So like that's I think the other thing is like, did he just lay siege to Ba Sing Se because that was the key thing, that was the battle he knew he had to fight because it was his destiny, or did he do everything else that was required? That's, I think, what's not particularly clear, in that Iroh, obviously, as we know him, comes across as not really being very ambitious, not really wanting the throne when it's asked of him. So was there ever a point where he really, wanted the throne? He felt like he was going to be the Fire Lord someday, and so on. So there's that. Of course, there's the big dynamic we've never got anything on, really, and that is Iroh and Ozai. We just don't know what their relationship was. There's tons of stuff you could do with them when they were younger, in terms of obviously establishing a sort of dynamic about which one was more powerful? Was it always the case where, Iroh was the more powerful one, but his mentality meant that it never really came across that way, whereas Ozai was very aggressive, so it seemed like he was more powerful, even though, like, Iroh may be embracing kind of the other nations a bit more, being willing to, maybe research the different like cultures of the Fire Nation, whether that be the Sun Warriors, the Sages, and so on. So he knows the true ways of firebending, which is why he like focuses on the breath rather than like the muscles. So there's those type of things, and you'd sort of wonder, like, he seems to know a lot of this ancient stuff, in that one of the big things, of course, would be that at some point in the earlier in the series, Iroh goes to Roku's island and specifically manages to get the artifact of the Crown Prince back. That the reason he has that to give to Zuko is because he must have got it at some point. Because otherwise, like, Roku's home was just kind of covered in ash. Like, it was destroyed completely. He had to have gone there. And the only reason he would know that potentially it was there or would have gone there would probably be because he researched, like, the history of what happened. Hence why he's able to tell Zuko, or, like, direct Zuko to the information that he wants, and is able to, like, get that big reveal of, like, you are related to Roku, and so on. And then that's another angle on it as well. We know from the Search comics that Azulon's approach with Ozai was to find the descendants of Roku, mix them in with his children to basically enhance the bloodline of the royal family. So was that just a thing he decided after Iroh, or was it or was Iroh ever, like, involved in that? Like, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, it seems to be like this is like Azulon's big plan to enhance the bloodline of the Fire Nation royal family. And so it would make sense that he would try to kind of do that with his firstborn. But if his firstborn was a more kind of free-spirited character like Iroh seemed to be in his earlier days, it would sort of make sense that Iroh maybe found, true love on his own, and he kind of let Iroh just kind of have a child with whoever Iroh's wife ended up being, Liu Ten's mother, whatever that story is. That's another thing. There's so many, like, unique, like, here's something we don't know about Iroh. We don't know who Liu Ten's mother is. What was that relationship like? Is the mother potentially from a different nation? Because, like, I don't think that would be too crazy of a thing. Realistically, like, I assume the other characters, like Ozai, Azula, must have known her. So, realistically, she's probably a Fire Nation woman, but again, we don't know. The common theory that really has no basis to it, but sort of makes sense, given that she's just flat out not mentioned, is that she probably, like, died giving birth to Liu Ten. But again, anything could have really happened there. So there's, like, all of that stuff that we just don't have any idea about. And again, that's why, like, Iroh's story is very specifically suited to getting its own, like, story. Like, if they announced a new Avatar comic and it was just called, like, Avatar Last Airbender comic, Iroh, I think everyone will be all over that because he's a fan favorite character. I think everyone's aware of the kind of uniqueness and mystery to his kind of backstory and all of these little things that we do and don't know. And then obviously the book would be able to, like, introduce some of the more kind of nuanced kind of things that are brought up here, like the fact that, oh wait, yeah, Iroh and Ozai have never really interacted, and that sort of thing. In that, again, it's something I kind of always bring up with Iroh, but just the fact that Ozai and Azula both give him, like, zero respect, even though I think it's kind of, like, the easiest thing to say almost about firebending is that, like, yeah, Iroh's the best firebender that we've ever seen in the series, basically. There's kind of no question whatsoever. That, like, I don't think there's that many people out there who'd put Ozai above him. As much as, like, there is that line where Iroh says that, oh, I don't know if I could defeat Ozai. But again, that's just Iroh being kind of humble, whereas Ozai, of course, thinks he's the best, always. But the fans, I think, just based on our knowledge of the universe, firebending, and the two characters, would have to say it kind of has to be Iroh who's the more powerful. So did he just never display his potential to Ozai and Azula, so they just don't know? And other characters like maybe Azulon and Zuko are aware of what Iroh can do when he puts his mind to it. But that's why he's such a nice character. And again, the niceness, the fact that he's a very approachable character, is another thing that comes up with the search. Ursa says that basically the only things that really allowed her to in any way be comfortable during her time in the Fire Nation capital were her children, Azula, Zuko, and also Iroh. That she became friends with Iroh, and Iroh kind of helped her through this time. So there's another dynamic that I'd love to see, like the first time they met, how their dynamic went down and stuff like that. That seems very, very interesting to me. So just little bits and pieces all over the series just lead you to kind of be like, this is the story that has to happen at some point. Like, there's no way they can just never tell any details of this story. Maybe it's a bit of a stretch to expect them to tell us like everything about every single like event in his life, but it seems kind of perfect in a way, where you kind of tell this as like a kind of life story of Iroh type thing. You could even set it up with the premise being like he's like on his like deathbed or something like that. He's about to, you know, meditate over to the spirit world to continue on as a spirit, and he maybe tells someone his life story at the end. You can really picture how all of this kind of happens, where like you get the early years dynamic between, you know, Iroh and Ozai. You get to develop Azulon as a character, perhaps as like a father, and see a different side to Azulon. See who he focused on, who he didn't focus on. Did he always respect Iroh? Did he maybe not care too much about Ozai at first, or something like that? Ela as well, like, given that we know the name of like Iroh and Ozai's mother, like that'd be a kind of cool thing if we got development on her. Obviously, as they kind of grew up, you get the idea that you can eventually like develop Iroh into a character who's very different than Azulon, very different than Ozai, and see where that goes. Introduce the idea of him going to see the Sun Warriors, his destiny coming in at some point, him potentially meeting the mother of Liu Ten, the birth of Liu Ten, his siege of Ba Sing Se. You could tell a story about, and of course the other thing is I suppose it's an extra interpretation of what Iroh says in The Tale of Iroh. When he sings the song at the end, he says, "I'm sorry I couldn't help you." As in, like, I'm sorry I couldn't help you the way I helped everyone else over the course of this day. So the fact that he like apologizes and says, "I couldn't help you with what?" Like, we sort of know that like the idea is that like Iroh was the main commander of the siege of Ba Sing Se. It was going on so long. Iroh wasn't always on the front lines, but it seems like Liu Ten was, and that it just happened one day. But the fact that Iroh kind of like apologizes and is so like, oh, like, I'm kind of responsible in a way for what happened to you. Is it just that the reason this siege is even happening is because Iroh felt it was his destiny and it kind of backfired on Liu Ten and thus him? Or was there actually some sort of an issue maybe at this point in Liu Ten's life where they disagreed on things? Maybe Liu Ten was more turning out like an Ozai or an Azulon rather than like his own father Iroh. So was there disagreements between those two? Because it clearly was a very close relationship, at least at some point, and that explains why Iroh then goes to such great lengths to make sure that he's there to have an influence on Zuko's life afterwards. His nephew, who he sees like potential in and sees that like Ozai's not giving any attention to, that he can help Zuko along the way. That's the sort of thing I'd like to see. And of course the other thing is that we know that Iroh and Zuko, like, their connection of course has to happen at like an earlier point prior to like Zuko's banishment. So seeing those early days of like Iroh connecting with Zuko, and potentially even like Zuko and Liu Ten's relationship. I think if you ever told that story, just Liu Ten as a character is probably one of the most interesting things to come out of that story. And then of course, the death of Liu Ten, like I can just imagine that if they ever had a story where they told it, how you'd frame that of like Iroh finding out what it did to him, how exactly the siege fell apart, in terms of like how big was the Earth Kingdom army they were up against and stuff like that. And then afterwards, where did he go? Is this where he joins the Order of the White Lotus? Is the Order of the White Lotus before this? Does he go to the Northern Water Tribe to learn from the Waterbenders and develop lightning redirection? And so on. In that, like, he obviously knows a lot of these other members of the White Lotus, so does he meet Piandao around this time? Does he meet Zhang Zhang around this time? Because, like, I think that's probably one of the other things, is like Zhang Zhang at some point, like prior to the series, deserts the Fire Nation military. Does Iroh find out about that and then bring Zhang Zhang in? Does Iroh know of Zhang Zhang prior to that moment happening? And then there could be some sort of a connection between Iroh and Piandao, because Piandao was Zuko's swordmaster. So he must have come across like that training happening at some point. And maybe that's where that connection came in, and either Piandao brought Iroh into the White Lotus or the other way around. Again, depends on what way they really want to go with it. And then of course the Spirit World journey. When exactly this happens is probably the interesting thing. I believe it's Avatar Extras that kind of alludes to the fact that it more or less is in response to like the death of Liu Ten, that a lot of the Spirit World stuff with Iroh is kind of directly a result of like Liu Ten, in that him wanting to like find a way to go to the Spirit World to like find Liu Ten and like say something to him, kind of maybe something he didn't get a chance to say before Liu Ten died. That's super interesting, because obviously the question is, we sort of know Iroh's a spiritual character, and we know if you're spiritual enough that you can meditate into the spirit world, but like what lengths did Iroh go to like research this to make it happen? Did he just, like other characters have done since, meditate and go in, or did he really kind of go to amazing lengths, like amazing spiritual tea or something like that, like bringing the White Lotus in terms of learning from all the different nations about how to be the most spiritual? And then, given that it's basically confirmed at this point and alluded to as like a legend, it's kind of become a known thing around the world that like Iroh's been to the spirit world, so he succeeded in this. What did he do there? What did he get up to there? Did it change him at all going there? Did anything with Liu Ten happen? Because that would confirm a lot to us about like what happens to like people after they die in the Avatar world. Like, is it just reincarnation, like we sort of get the idea of just from the Avatar, or what? That's what we don't really know. And then obviously after that, it'd be more emphasis on Iroh and like Ursa, Iroh and Zuko. I think it would also be a nice time to kind of explain fully in a more kind of story-driven scenario how that the reason Zuko has a ship and a crew to even go with him, despite Zuko being banished, is because of Iroh. Like, if not, it would have been just Zuko on his own, banished, looking for the Avatar. But because of Iroh, he actually has a crew and a chance. And I'd love to get that moment of like Iroh getting Commander G and that squad on board for this mission, and just kind of like all the stuff that Iroh did kind of behind the scenes to allow this to happen. It would also probably allow you to tell the story of their initial journeys. Obviously, we see it in the Western Air Temple episode when Zuko joins the group, that we get a flashback to them at the Western Air Temple, with Zuko saying that we're going to travel to all of the air temples to try and find the Avatar, and then we'll just travel the rest of the world. There's obviously the Last Airbender movie prequel manga, which basically covers this journey with Zuko of like traveling to all the air temples. Obviously, it's a different kind of canon in that that's the movie canon, but they kind of established that like Zuko kind of meets some of the other characters along the way. Like he meets like Fire Sage Shayu, I think, in one of the temples. He meets Guru Patik at one of the other ones. And he meets, in this case, like the red spirit who teaches him how to use the swords in that case. I'd like to know if like any of that stuff happened, or did he just arrive at like 4 empty temples along the way? Because if Zuko has actually visited all 4 air temples, that means he's been to the northern air temple and realistically potentially came across that group of nomads who lived there, like Teo the Mechanist. I think the timeline could work out where like that happened afterwards, and Zuko could have gone there initially and not found them, because obviously Zuko was banished for a few years. So there's a way it could obviously work out with him like avoiding a lot of these characters, but you know, he could have like come across Guru Patik potentially. And then did anything else notable happen in like the early stages of this journey? And then, you know, like, do you cover even further ground after that of like little bits and pieces that fill in the gaps like in the show? Like, what exactly did Iroh do during the eclipse to escape from jail? How did he join up with the Order of the White Lotus after this point? Kind of little moments like that. And then, of course, if you were telling like Iroh's full life story, later on in life, his decision to become a spirit, and in the very last stages of his life, and seemingly not tell anyone, because Zuko is obviously shocked when Korra tells him that, oh yeah, I've talked to Iroh before, he's in the spirit world, and Zuko's like, what? So Iroh obviously in kind of secret kind of traveled to the spirit world, and that like he obviously died suddenly, and they just found him when he was dead, and they weren't aware that he had actually meditated out of his body. So that's a little bit of a story as well. So gonna end the video there as a just kind of like my updated take on kind of like the timeline of events for Iroh's journey and the different bits and pieces that happen, because every so often I see like a notification come up on my YouTube channel of just like, oh, comment on this Iroh video, and I kind of look back on that one and be like, okay, like at the time I had these certain opinions on like, oh, this had to have happened here and there. Obviously this video I'm recording fairly recently after the full rewatch that I've discussed on my channel. And I definitely feel a little bit differently about a lot of the events, about how they played out, and that I think in that initial video I was kind of more like, oh yeah, almost everything had to have happened after the death of Lu Ten, because of that line that Iroh says that like, oh, you know, if I don't burn it to the ground first, so that must mean he was kind of bad and evil back then. But I think just the fact that the characters laugh at that, even Ursa, makes it more seem like a joke, rather than like, oh, Iroh's really cruel, he's actually going to burn it to the ground. It was actually just a joke. Given the fact that like Zuko and Ursa both laugh at it, and I suppose Ursa must in no way could be considered like a Fire Nation like patriot, given what the royal family have kind of done to her and kind of forced her into. Maybe she doesn't know the full scope of the politics, but you know, her laughing at like, oh, they're going to burn Boston State to the ground, like, you know, that sort of thing. But I think the series kind of presents it like, no, Iroh's always been a very different character to the likes of Ozai and Azulon and Sozin, and here is a character representing that, and that a lot of this stuff had to have happened before the death of Lu Ten, but also some of it was afterwards. So that's just my updated take on that. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on Iroh's story. Let me know how interested you would be in seeing Iroh's full story told in a comic or something like that. But yeah, that's been the discussion topic for this week. Thanks for watching, listening, and